For those who might be more familiar with my whole story, they will know that my current journey with ME-CFS is not the first time that I have been ill with these kinds of illnesses. In fact, back in 2014 and early 2015, I actually had POTS, multiple chemical sensitivity, and fibromyalgia. And back in 2015, I recovered from these conditions by using a neuroplasticity program, and I was actually well for about 3 years. Unfortunately, then I developed ME-CFS. And although I have gone through periods of using neuroplasticity this time around, I have found that it has not actually helped me to recover. It has not helped me beyond a certain point. And so in today's video, I'm going to be comparing and contrasting between the first time I used neuroplasticity and this time, and I'll talk about why I think it hasn't helped me to recover and offer some general reflections on why neuroplasticity sometimes really helps some people, other times just a little bit, and sometimes not at all. But first, my name is Patrick Usher, and I am author of the book Understanding ME-CFS and Strategies for Healing, in which I break down some of the latest, most exciting breakthrough research into ME-CFS and long COVID, as well as talking about the various treatment strategies that I have tried in order to improve my quality of life as an ME-CFS patient. Alright, so let's go back over 11 years now to when I first became ill. And back then, as I say, it was more POTS, chemical sensitivity, fibromyalgia. I did struggle with ME-CFS-like symptoms too, although they were not as severe as what I would end up getting this time around. So I had these things. I had all over body pain. I had the very high heart rate when I stood up, and I was sensitive to chemical smells. And in the spring of 2015, I came across the dynamic neural retraining system, a neuroplasticity program which suggests that the root cause of these kinds of illnesses is a kind of traumatized state or injury to the limbic system, and that you need to practice brain retraining exercises to kind of trick the brain out of the traumatized state and therefore heal these kinds of sensitivities. And, chemical sensitivity is clearly something that goes on in the brain. Fibromyalgia, at least classic fibromyalgia, is also created in the brain, although there's a complicated story with fibromyalgia. So it posited this, and I was highly skeptical, but I thought, what do I have to lose? So I set about doing the DNRS. And from mid-April until mid-November, something like that, I practiced the program diligently. I did it more than necessary. I probably did around, 500, 600, 700 hours of the visualizations over that time. And, they're really focused on thinking of things that are the opposite of trauma, because the brain can't understand the difference between real and imagined. So you're kind of driving, you're moving your brain out of a traumatized state. And I focused 100% on recovery. I was completely dedicated, completely disciplined, and I really was fully committed. And I recovered. I started to see changes quickly. I mean, my physical exercise capacity improved, very noticeably within weeks. By 4 months, I was climbing through, hills and forests for an hour a day. Basically, physical capacity got a lot better. Adrenaline release that was pretty constant prior settled down. I started to tolerate foods better. My chemical sensitivities went away completely in 2 months. So previously I would, get hit by a wave of chemical smells, and that just stopped. Fibromyalgic pains went away after about a month. And, fast forward a year from that point, and I was going on 16-kilometer hikes. So and I no longer met the heart rate criteria increase for POTS, etc. So basically, I recovered. Now, I'm not sure if I was 100% right after all of it, but it was still a dramatic turnaround. No longer met the POTS criteria, no longer had problems with chemical smells, no longer had fibromyalgia. I was feeling tons better. And then I went on to have a better, a decent period for 3 years in which I didn't really have any significant health issues. Fast forward to developing ME-CFS, and it's been a different story. Interestingly, I have not really had sensitivity to chemical smells, very minorly, not really. I've not had fibromyalgia-like pains. So whatever I did back with the DNRS seems to have held for those issues. I have had orthostatic problems again, but I would imagine for different reasons. I think perhaps more related to low blood volume. I don't think I particularly had low blood volume back in 2015. So anyway, what I have found this time, because I have had periods, significant periods of practicing brain retraining, and there is no doubt but that it improves some things. The nervous system dysregulation, the sense that this excessive sympathetic state or freeze response or just excessive stress and just feeling like you're living in a nervous system that's kind of going all over the place. I have found that I can change that quite quickly if I commit to brain retraining. And I can suddenly find myself in a nervous system that feels more solid, my stress tolerance improves, things just seem more stable. Although I haven't had to deal with smell sensitivity this time around, noise sensitivity has been an issue. So, for example, if in the times where I've lived with my dad, if I hear him clearing his throat 2 rooms away, I can jump out of my skin with that. Or hearing him chewing can be really aggravating. Those kinds of things I can also get rid of within a few days of practicing brain retraining. What I have found is that although I can really change the autonomic side of things, that has not changed my exercise intolerance or getting PEM, or other symptoms that I associate with ME-CFS for me, like the feeling of poor blood perfusion throughout the body, blood not getting into the muscles, into the brain. Things like dryness and difficulty sweating. I have a kind of autoimmune problem, which is common in ME-CFS and which is creating issues with producing moisture in my body. So what I would call kind of ongoing things have not changed as a result. So I can improve the autonomic stuff, but there's kind of a range of problems that seem to have otherwise set into my body that then mean that if I try and do too much physically, I still get post-exertional malaise. So this time around, I haven't got past a certain point. And the reason I think that is the case is because, let's just say for the sake of argument, and I'm not saying this is definitely the case, I don't know, but let's say for the sake of argument, the root cause of these illnesses, of ME-CFS, is the autonomic disturbance. Let's say it is in fact the maladaptive neuroplastic state. The problem is that so many other burdens developed on top of that for me this time around. Particularly, I've had very bad low blood volume. In fact, it landed me in life-threatening situations. I've had very bad microclotting situation. In fact, my blood went black because it was so condensed with microclots. And I've also tested positive for the main autoantibodies associated with ME-CFS, and these can get into the heart, into the blood vessels, and they actually, again, impede the blood perfusion throughout the body and therefore lower the exercise tolerance. So I developed all these other problems, which, again, for the sake of argument, could be considered secondary. Once they actually develop and once they become strong and embedded, I believe that these can then be seen as significant enough to be impeding your progress, because even though you might be influencing maladaptive neuroplastic state pretty well, these other aspects have become very strong. All of this is quite speculative, but that doesn't mean in principle that someone who does neuroplasticity and breaks this particular part of the cycle might not then reduce the burdens on their body enough that it could potentially heal the other kinds of problems I'm mentioning. After all, ME-CFS is an illness of interlinking vicious cycles. The autonomic nervous system is part of those vicious cycles, but so is everything else, and they all feed back into each other. And I've done a video about which gives an overview of what ME-CFS likely actually is, according to the work of Professor Wirth and Professor Scheibenbogen. So perhaps it's feasible, brain retraining and enough resetting this component, you could actually end up with the body being able to do the rest of the work. And in my view, this is why some people can recover using neuroplasticity. Others make a bit of progress, like myself. They help out with the more obvious autonomic symptoms. And other people, the other burdens are so severe that they get very little progress at all. Now, so in a nutshell, that's why I think it's helped me, but I haven't recovered because there's too much else that has chronified, that has set into my body. And I do wonder if, as people are ill for longer, we think about my first journey, I wasn't too badly ill for too long. But I think as people are ill for longer, more things may change that make it harder to get over the hill. I think another factor is that when you have real deal ME-CFS, it's very hard for these other dysfunctions like autoantibodies and microclots and the blood volume to actually improve if you keep crashing. And I have to admit that although my pacing has got better, I'm not great at it. And I have noticed in the times where I managed to have a few weeks without crashing, I feel like my body's actually starting to heal. And I think that actually my personal greatest challenge, the thing that I would actually need to do to have any chance for the kind of internal environment of my body to actually heal, would be to, for example, not crash for 3 months, 4 months, and actually allow my body to be relieved of that particular burden, because crashes are a major burden, and thereby, hopefully, things internally could shift. Another comment I would make is that the way I went about my recovery efforts in 2015 was different to now. The fact is that I've been a lot more ill this time around. Thankfully, I'm doing a lot better these days, although I have some rough moments very often. But overall, in comparison to my first few years of having ME-CFS, and basically it's been harder to stick with things. I have found it very common that I will return to neuroplasticity or some other approach, and like the Buteyko method, which I use a lot, and I'll say, okay, I'm going to do this, but then I only stick with it for a week or 2 weeks, and then it falls away, because as I've been more ill and been more ill for a long time, sometimes I lose hope. I've often felt that I have one foot in despair and one foot in hope with these illnesses, whereas in 2015 I was like both feet in the hope camp and I just kept going. And I also saw positive impacts very quickly, so that gave me confidence. Whereas this time around, because I see positive impacts, but not beyond the autonomic issues, I kind of lose a bit of hope. And, life can feel hard enough with all the things that I have to juggle, and sometimes I just don't focus on following through in the ways that I did back then. So that's another factor. But anyway, that is basically the story, the differences between then and now. Back then it was all super straightforward. It was not entirely linear, but it was basically a story of great progress, relatively straightforwardly. And this time around it's been a lot more complicated. Where does this leave me for the future? Well, I actually think that the most important thing that I'm going to have to do at some point is not crash for a very long period of time. I believe that to be essential for me. And I do think that with terms of neuroplasticity, I will need to actually stick at it for a significant period of time. And I think there are certain different things that I need to work on. In my case, my spotlight, the capacity to place attention onto an object and keep it there, is very, very weak. And that's been shown to be an issue in the ME-CFS research. And I believe it actually plays in, this lack of executive function does play into the autonomic disturbance. So I think working on fixing something like that over a sustained period of time could be very helpful. I'm also interested in potentially using different devices that may be able to help me out a bit without me having to do the effort all myself. But I do think I'm going to have to return to neuroplasticity at some point and actually follow through and try and embed the necessary neuroplastic change and see what happens. What I find for the moment is that if I do it, nervous system calms down. If I don't do it for a while, things go back haywire, particularly if I crash. And if I return to the neuroplasticity, I make progress more quickly because I have done it in the past, and so my brain remembers those more positive pathways. Anyway, that's been the situation. I'd be very curious to hear what this sparks off in you, especially in terms of, there's a lot of kind of ideas that are claimed in relation to this area, ME-CFS, by both camps, those who think neuroplasticity is the bee's knees and others who think that we're not even allowed to talk about it. But I'll be interested to hear your experience. Have you done these programs? Did you make a lot of progress? Only a little progress? Why do you think that was? Please leave your comments down below and I will see you in the next video.